A lonely fortune. Henry Evans stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, the weight of his existence pressing down on him like an invisible force. Below him, the city pulsed with life, cars weaving through congested streets, neon signs flickering against towering skyscrapers, distant laughter spilling from rooftop bars. Yet, none of it reached him. The penthouse was a masterpiece of modern architecture, filled with everything a man of his wealth could desire. Italian leather furniture, priceless art, an underground garage stocked with vehicles that could buy entire neighborhoods. But amidst all the grandeur, there was a silence so deep it gnawed at his soul. At 45, Henry had reached the pinnacle of success. He was the CEO of Evans Global Holdings, a business empire spanning finance, real estate, and technology. A name that commanded respect. A fortune that granted him anything he could possibly want. Except for what he truly needed. He exhaled, pressing a hand against the cool glass as he looked out into the abyss of the city. His reflection stared back at him, hollow-eyed and weary. Despite the custom-tailored suits and carefully groomed appearance, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was still that scared little boy trapped in the system, shuffling from one foster home to another. No matter how much money he had, he couldn't buy himself a past that didn't hurt. A past that refused to be forgotten. Henry rarely spoke of his childhood. The world only saw the man he had become, not the shattered boy he once was. His parents were a mystery, no birth records, no relatives, no old family photographs. All he knew was that one day, when he was 5 years old, he was abandoned. Left outside the doors of St. Augustine's orphanage, clutching a tattered teddy bear with one missing eye. What followed was a revolving door of foster homes, each one colder than the last. Some were indifferent, others outright cruel. He learned quickly that love was conditional, that kindness often came with an expiration date. He had spent 15 years being passed around like an unwanted package. Until, at 16, he aged out of the system. Alone. Homeless. Forgotten. With no one to rely on, Henry clawed his way up from the bottom. He worked brutal shifts in factories, slept in train stations, saved every penny he earned. He taught himself about business, about money, how it moved, how it could be controlled. By 25, he had made his first million. By 30, he was on the cover of Forbes. The world applauded his success. Called him a self-made billionaire. But no one knew the truth. No one knew that, even after all these years, he still woke up at night hearing the voices of the children he left behind. A cold, empty legacy. Henry turned away from the window and walked across the penthouse, his footsteps echoing through the cavernous space. His home was immaculate, curated by the best interior designers money could buy. Every detail was meticulously arranged, the furniture, the art, the lighting. But it was all just decoration. He had built a fortress of luxury around himself, yet it only served to isolate him further. At night, when the city quieted, the silence was suffocating. He had spent decades trying to erase the orphan child he used to be, but he had never truly escaped him. Perhaps that was why he never married. Why he never had children of his own. What kind of father would he be? What could he offer a child when he had never known a father's love himself? He sank onto the couch, rubbing his temples. A question had been festering in his mind for years, growing louder as he aged. What was it all for? The empire. The wealth. The accolades. What did it matter if he had no one to share it with? What did it matter if, in the end, he died alone, just another name on a Forbes list, forgotten the moment his fortune was inherited by strangers? For the first time in his life, Henry Evans admitted something to himself. He was miserable. And if he didn't change something soon, he would suffocate under the weight of his own emptiness. An idea that changed everything. The thought came suddenly, like a whisper in the back of his mind. It started as a simple question. What if he could change the ending? Not just for himself, but for others. He grabbed his phone, his fingers tightening around it as he stared at the blank screen. He had the power. The money. The resources. For the first time in his life, he realized he could do something no one else had done before. He could rewrite the story, for every forgotten child trapped in the system. His heartbeat quickened. He would adopt. Not one child. Not two. All of them. Every orphan who had been tossed aside. Every child whose name had been lost in a sea of forgotten paperwork. He would give them what he never had, a home. A future. A family. Without hesitating, he pulled up the contact information for the National Foster Care Network and dialed the number. A woman's voice answered on the other end. "Hello, this is Margaret with the Foster Care Services. How can I assist you?" Henry took a breath, his grip on the phone tightening. "My name is Henry Evans," he said firmly. "And I want to adopt." There was a pause. "That's wonderful. How many children are you interested in adopting?" Henry's jaw clenched. He already knew his answer. All of them. The silence that followed was deafening. "I'm sorry, Mr. Evans. I don't think I heard you correctly." Henry's voice was unwavering. "You heard me. Every child in your system who doesn't have a home, I want them. I don't care what it takes." The woman let out a stunned breath. That's not how adoption works, sir. There are legal processes. Background checks. Anne. "I don't care how long it takes," Henry interrupted. "You have children suffering right now, don't you? Kids who are aging out of the system with nowhere to go." "Yes, but..." "Then let me help them." The woman hesitated. I need to talk to my supervisor." Henry nodded. "Do that." As he hung up the phone, a strange feeling settled in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Purpose. For the first time in his life, Henry Evans wasn't chasing money. He was chasing something far greater. And he had no idea that his decision would uncover dark secrets that had been buried for decades. Secrets that would change everything. Forever. A family born from pain. The shockwaves of a billionaire's decision. The call Henry Evans made that night sent ripples through the foster care system like an earthquake. At first, the officials thought they had misheard him. No one adopts an entire foster care system. It was unheard of, legally impossible, and, most of all, insane. Meetings were scheduled. Lawyers were called. Government agencies scrambled to understand why a billionaire would make such an outlandish offer. Some thought it was a PR stunt. Others assumed he was looking for tax benefits. The media got wind of it, and headlines flooded the internet. Billionaire offers to adopt thousands of orphans, but why? Henry Evans' bizarre philanthropy, a heartfelt gesture or a corporate strategy? Evans' empire to become a foster home? Experts weigh in. Henry ignored all of it. He didn't care what the world thought. He knew his reasons, and that was enough. But the government did care. They refused outright. The logistics alone were a nightmare. Adoption required extensive background checks, psychological evaluations, and home inspections. A single person couldn't legally adopt more than a handful of children at a time. So Henry did what he did best. He found another way. Instead of adopting them one by one, he created a foundation, the Evans Home for Lost Children. A legally recognized institution, fully funded and structured as a network of homes across the country. He purchased massive estates, renovated old schools, and built entirely new communities designed not as orphanages, but as real homes. He hired child psychologists, teachers, personal mentors, and even ex-foster kids who had survived the system to help run it. Within 3 months, the first 150 children moved in. And it wasn't long before Henry met the ones who would change everything. The first children. They arrived in waves. Dozens of children, some barely old enough to walk, others already hardened by the brutal reality of life. Some had been abandoned. Some had run away from unspeakable horrors. And some carried secrets so dark, Henry had no idea what he was truly bringing into his life. The first night, he visited the largest estate. A sprawling 50-acre property in upstate New York that had been transformed into a sanctuary. He wanted to meet the children himself, make sure they knew they weren't just numbers on a spreadsheet. The air was filled with the nervous murmurs of kids who had never been chosen before. Henry stepped into the main hall, where the children had gathered. Their eyes studied him, some with curiosity, others with deep suspicion. A little girl stepped forward. She was no older than 6, her dark hair tangled, her face smudged with dirt. She clutched a small stuffed rabbit so tightly that its fabric was worn thin. Her eyes held something far beyond her years. She didn't speak. Just stared. "What's your name?" Henry asked gently, kneeling to her level. Silence. One of the social workers leaned in. "Her name is Lily," she whispered. "She doesn't talk much." Henry gave her a small smile. "That's okay. You don't have to talk." For a long moment, Lily just stood there, her little fingers tightening around the stuffed rabbit. Then, slowly, she reached out, and placed the toy in his hand. It was the first time in his entire life Henry felt something break inside him. A piece of himself he didn't even know was missing. Lily didn't know who he was. She didn't know about his billions. To her, he was just another adult. Another stranger. But for some reason, she chose to trust him. Not everyone trusted him. Not all the children were as welcoming as Lily. Some resented him. Jason was one of them. 17, angry, and done with the world. "This is bullshit," Jason muttered as Henry walked through the halls that first night. Henry turned. "You think so?" Jason crossed his arms. "Rich guy thinks he can fix everything with money. I've seen your type before." "I don't want to fix everything with money," Henry said calmly. "I want to give you a home." Jason laughed bitterly. "A home? You mean a mansion you'll lock us in until you get bored? Until you forget about us like every other foster parent?" Henry met his glare. He recognized that anger. It was the same anger he had felt when he was Jason's age. "I won't forget you," Henry said simply. Jason scoffed. "Yeah. Sure." But something shifted in his expression. A flicker of doubt. A tiny, dangerous sliver of hope. And Henry knew what Jason already feared: hope was the most dangerous thing in the world. The notes begin. The first few months were overwhelming. Henry split his time between the children's homes, getting to know each one personally. He was determined to make this work. But then, strange things started happening. It began with a note. A crumpled piece of paper, slipped under his bedroom door at the New York estate. "You shouldn't have adopted us." He stared at the words for a long time, a chill running down his spine. He didn't tell anyone. Maybe it was a joke. A prank from one of the kids who still didn't trust him. But then came another. "He's still watching us." Henry's stomach tightened. Who? The next morning, he found Jason sitting alone outside, staring at the woods beyond the estate. "You okay?" Henry asked. Jason didn't look at him. "You should stop." "Stop what?" Jason finally turned, his eyes darker than Henry had ever seen them. "Trying to save us." Henry frowned. "Why?" Jason leaned in slightly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Because some of us don't want to be saved." A strange, creeping sense of unease settled over Henry. He wanted to believe Jason was just testing him, pushing him away before he could get too close. But deep down, he knew better. Something was wrong. Something was hiding in these children's pasts. And he was about to uncover something he never could have imagined. The whispered warnings. The notes grow darker. Henry Evans had faced corporate wars, ruthless business rivals, and the brutal, lonely climb to wealth. But nothing prepared him for this. The notes kept coming. At first, they were vague. You shouldn't have adopted us. He's watching. Then, they became unsettling. He knows where we are. We are not safe. You shouldn't have brought us here. And then, the worst one came. It was late at night. Henry had returned to his New York estate, exhausted but satisfied that he was making progress with the children. As he entered his room, something felt off. The air was too still. Then, he saw it. A single sheet of paper, placed perfectly in the center of his bed. He's coming for us. A cold chill ran down Henry's spine. The children's fear. By now, Henry knew something wasn't right. The children weren't just afraid of their past, they were hiding from something. Jason, the 17-year-old who had been the most openly hostile toward him, was acting strangely different. He was quiet. Watchful. Almost like he was waiting for something. Lily, the 6-year-old who rarely spoke, had begun sleepwalking. Henry had found her standing by the windows of the mansion one night, staring into the darkness outside. "What are you looking at?" Henry had asked gently. She had only whispered, "The trees." Henry frowned. "The trees?" Lily nodded. "That's where he watches from." Henry's stomach tightened. "Who, Lily?" She turned to him, her little hands clutching the fabric of her nightgown. "The man from the house." The words sent a shiver down Henry's spine. The house. He had heard that name before. It had been whispered among some of the older children. Always in hushed voices. Always with the same underlying fear. Lily, Henry crouched to her level, keeping his voice calm. "What house?" She didn't answer. Instead, she just turned and walked back to her room. Henry watched her go, his unease deepening. Who was watching them? And what was the house? The investigation begins. Henry wasn't the kind of man to ignore danger. The next morning, he called in a private investigation team. If something had happened to these children before they came to him, he needed to know what it was. He sent them a list of all the children currently in his care. Within days, the team uncovered something horrifying. Many of them had been in the same foster home. A private facility, long since shut down, called Willowbrook House. Henry had never heard of it. But Jason had. Jason's warning. Henry found Jason alone in the backyard of the estate, sitting on the steps with a cigarette he wasn't supposed to have. "You smoke now?" Henry asked, walking over. Jason smirked without humor. "I do a lot of things now." Henry sat next to him. "I looked into your past. Into a place called Willowbrook House." Jason's smirk disappeared instantly. For the first time since meeting him, Henry saw something real in Jason's expression. Fear. Jason exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "You should stop looking." Henry frowned. "Why?" Jason crushed the cigarette beneath his shoe. "Because once you start looking into Willowbrook, it starts looking back." Henry narrowed his eyes. "What does that mean?" Jason didn't answer at first. He just stared ahead, as if seeing something Henry couldn't. Then, finally, he said, "You ever wonder why so many of us don't have families? Why so many of us were never adopted?" Henry's breath caught. Jason continued, his voice lower now. Because some of us were never meant to leave that place. A cold weight settled in Henry's stomach. He thought back to the notes. To Lily's whispers. To the way some of the children still flinched when doors opened too quickly. Something terrible had happened at Willowbrook House. And Henry had just reopened the door to it. The name that changed everything. That night, Henry didn't sleep. He spent hours digging through records, looking for anything he could find about Willowbrook House. But there was almost nothing. No news articles. No old reports. It was as if it had been erased. But then, he found something. A single name. Richard Grayson. The man who had owned and operated Willowbrook House. A highly respected foster care provider. A philanthropist. A man who had adopted hundreds of children. And, as Henry would soon discover, a monster. The truth comes out. Henry's investigators dug deeper. What they found was worse than he could have ever imagined. Richard Grayson had been running an underground network. Children weren't being fostered at Willowbrook House. They were being sold. Some were trafficked. Some were adopted by people who never reported them again. Some simply vanished. And yet, no one had ever stopped him. Because no one knew. Or rather, no one wanted to know. The warning comes too late. By the time Henry had uncovered the truth, it was too late. That night, another note appeared. Not under his door this time. But inside his bedroom. You're making a mistake. The realization was like ice in his veins. Someone had been in his house. Watching him. He wasn't just looking into Willowbrook anymore. Willowbrook was looking back. The House of Shadows. The shadows move. Henry Evans was no stranger to threats. In the business world, power invited danger, and he had fought his fair share of corporate predators. But this was different. This wasn't about money or contracts. This was about children. His children. And someone wanted them back. The note found inside his bedroom was proof of that. Someone had been inside his home. The security team had found no forced entry, no broken windows, no footage of an intruder. Whoever left that note knew how to move unseen. And they wanted him to know he wasn't in control. For the first time in his life, Henry felt something foreign laced with his anger. Fear. But fear alone wasn't going to stop him. Henry Evans had built an empire from nothing. And he sure as hell wasn't about to lose his new family to some ghost from the past. He was going to war. Jason breaks his silence. Jason was the key. Henry knew that if anyone had real answers, it was him. After what had happened in the backyard, the way Jason had warned him, Henry had given him space. He didn't push. But now, there was no time for caution. Henry found Jason in the game room, half-heartedly playing pool with some of the younger boys. Jason, Henry said. Jason barely looked up. What? We need to talk. Jason sighed, muttering something under his breath before setting his cue stick down. He followed Henry to the study, slumping into a chair like he didn't care. But Henry knew better. The tension in Jason's shoulders, the way his fingers tapped anxiously on the armrest, he was nervous. Good. That meant Henry was getting close to the truth. Henry pulled the crumpled note from his pocket and placed it on the desk between them. Jason didn't even blink. You recognize this? Henry asked. Jason stared at the note for a long moment before exhaling sharply. Yeah. So, you know who wrote it? Jason shook his head. Doesn't matter who wrote it. It does to me. Jason finally looked at him. There was something dark in his eyes. Something broken. You don't get it, do you? Jason leaned forward, voice lower now. It's not about who wrote the note. It's about the fact that they could. Henry narrowed his eyes. What do you mean? Jason clenched his jaw. It means he knows where we are. And he's letting us know. Henry felt his pulse spike. Who? Jason leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face like he was tired of keeping secrets. Then, finally, he said the name. Richard Grayson. Henry's blood ran cold. Willowbrook was no orphanage. Jason told him everything. Willowbrook House wasn't a home. It was a hunting ground. Richard Grayson didn't run a foster home, he ran an operation. Children were sent there from different parts of the country, often with little to no paperwork. Once inside, they were separated. The younger kids were treated like livestock, groomed, trained, and eventually placed with select individuals. The older ones? The ones who fought back. They were sent to the basement. Jason's face darkened. You don't want to know what happens in the basement. But Henry did. He needed to. Because Lily had been there. Because Jason had been there. And because, in the deepest part of his memory, in the darkest corners of his past, Henry had a feeling. He had been there, too. The realization that shattered him. Henry's hands clenched into fists. How did you get out? Jason hesitated. Then, I ran. But how? Jason looked away. Because someone helped me. Henry's breath hitched. Who? Jason's jaw tightened. You. Silence. A slow, crushing weight settled onto Henry's chest. What? Jason finally met his eyes. You were there, Henry. His voice was softer now, almost pitying. You don't remember, do you? Henry couldn't breathe. Images flashed in his mind. A cold basement. A steel door. A shadow standing over him. A voice saying, "Good boys don't ask questions." No. No, no, no. Jason leaned closer. You got out first. You escaped. And when you did, you made sure the rest of us had a chance, too. Henry felt like the room was spinning. He had always known there were gaps in his past. That his earliest memories were hazy at best. But this? He had survived the house. And he had left others behind. The children who never made it. Henry wasn't the only child who had been there. And he wasn't the only one who had escaped. But not all of them had been lucky. There were others, Jason said. Kids who never made it out. And now that you've taken us in, he thinks you're trying to finish what you started. Henry's stomach churned. What I started? Jason exhaled. Richard Grayson thinks you're making up for leaving us behind. And he doesn't like unfinished business. Henry understood now. The notes weren't warnings. They were a message. A reminder that Grayson was still out there. That he still had power. That he could take them back whenever he wanted. And worst of all, he wanted Henry to remember. The past comes for Henry. That night, Henry barely slept. He sat in his office, staring at the old black and white photograph his investigators had found. A photo of Willowbrook House. And there, standing in the background, barely noticeable, was a boy. Thin. Frail. Eyes hollow. A boy who looked exactly like him. Henry's hands shook as he traced the faded edges of the picture. He had spent his whole life running from the past. And now, it had found him. Then, his phone buzzed. A text. Unknown number, I always knew you'd come back. Welcome home. Henry's blood ran ice cold. The past wasn't just watching him. It was coming for him. And this time, it wouldn't let him escape. The betrayal. The message that changed everything. Henry Evans stared at his phone, his pulse hammering. I always knew you'd come back. Welcome home. A text message from an unknown number. But he knew exactly who it was from. Richard Grayson. The past wasn't just watching him. It was waiting for him. And now, it was calling him home. The plan to end it. Henry didn't waste time. He mobilized his people. The security team reinforced every estate where the children lived. His personal investigators doubled their efforts. He hired cyber experts to trace the number. But when the results came back, it made his stomach drop. The message had been sent from inside the estate. Someone inside his home had sent it. The betrayal had already begun. The children knew before he did. The children were restless. They knew. Jason wouldn't talk. He looked afraid. Lily wouldn't sleep. She whispered to herself at night. And the other kids? Some of them looked relieved. Like they had been waiting for this. That's when Henry realized the truth. Not all of them wanted to be saved. Some of them still belonged to Grayson. The turncoat. The betrayal came faster than Henry expected. It happened during the night shift. Henry's head of security, James Holt, a man he had trusted for years, walked into the estate with 6 armed men. Henry was in his office when the door burst open. James stood there, gun in hand. Henry didn't even flinch. I was wondering when you'd show your true colors. James gave him a cold smile. You've been asking too many questions, Henry. Some doors should stay closed. Henry clenched his fists. You're working for him. James tilted his head. You never really left Willowbrook, did you? The words hit Henry like a bullet. His own past was the reason he had been targeted. Grayson had let him go all those years ago for a reason. And now, Henry was beginning to understand why. A name he had forgotten. You were a ghost, Henry, James continued, stepping into the office. The men behind him spread out, blocking the exits. You were never supposed to make it. And yet, here you are, taking in the kids he lost, undoing all his hard work. Henry's eyes burned with rage. Hard work? You mean stealing and selling children? James smirked. You think you're saving them, but some of them don't want saving. Some of them still answer to him. Henry's stomach dropped. James saw the realization in his face and chuckled. You really thought you were safe? He stepped closer, lowering his voice. You really thought they all loved you? Henry's mind raced. The notes. The children warning him. You shouldn't have adopted us. He's watching us. It wasn't just fear. Some of them had been spying on him. Feeding him information. And the worst part? Henry had let them in. The child who betrayed him. Jason burst into the office at that moment, breathless. Henry. He stopped when he saw James and the armed men. James smiled. Ah. There he is. Jason's hands shook. Henry's gut twisted. Jason. Jason swallowed hard. Then he did the unthinkable. He walked over to James. And stood beside him. Henry felt like the air had been punched out of his lungs. James chuckled. You're a smart man, Henry. You should have known. Some of us never stopped being his children. Jason's face was unreadable. Henry's chest burned. After everything, after all I did for you. Jason's jaw clenched. You don't understand. Henry's hands curled into fists. Then make me understand. Jason hesitated. Then, finally, he spoke. If I don't help him, he'll take the ones I care about. He'll take Lily. Henry's breath caught. This wasn't about loyalty. It was about control. Grayson had never lost his grip on them. He still owned them. The truth about Henry's past. James smirked. It's funny, Henry. You're trying so hard to be the hero, but you forgot who you really are. Henry's pulse thundered. I know exactly who I am. James leaned in. Do you? Then he pulled something from his pocket. A photograph. Old. Worn. Black and white. Henry reached for it, his hands trembling. The image nearly made him sick. It was Willowbrook House. The basement. And there, in the center of the photo, was him. But he wasn't alone. He was standing beside Richard Grayson. And he was smiling. Henry's stomach churned. No. No, that's not real. James's grin widened. Oh, but it is. You weren't just a lost orphan, Henry. You were being trained. Groomed. Henry's breath came in short, shallow gasps. James leaned in, whispering the words that shattered everything. You were supposed to take over. The choice that defined him. Henry couldn't breathe. Was it true? Had he forgotten? Had he been one of them? Jason was watching him carefully now, gauging his reaction. Henry met his eyes. And he saw it. The doubt. Jason wanted to believe Henry wasn't like Grayson. Henry could use that. Jason, Henry said, voice shaking. Lily still trusts me. That has to mean something. Jason's lips parted. His grip on his own hands tightened. Grayson doesn't let people walk away, Henry continued. And yet, I did. And now, I'm standing here, fighting him. Does that sound like someone who was ever really on his side? Jason's fingers twitched. James saw it too. His smile faded. Jason started. Then, the door slammed open. A gunshot ripped through the air. James staggered. Blood bloomed on his chest. Jason turned in shock. Standing in the doorway, holding a smoking gun, was Lily. She was shaking, tears streaming down her face. But she wasn't crying for James. She was crying for Henry. He's lying, isn't he? Lily's voice was barely a whisper. You're not one of them. Henry swallowed hard. No, he said firmly, looking into her tear-filled eyes. I'm one of you. Jason made his choice in that moment. He turned on James's men. The battle for their freedom had begun. And Henry Evans wasn't going to lose. Not this time. The final battle. The aftermath of betrayal. Henry Evans stood frozen, his mind racing. The scent of gunpowder still lingered in the air. James Holt, the man he once trusted, was slumped on the floor, a gunshot wound in his chest. Lily, the 6-year-old who had barely spoken in weeks, was still clutching the pistol with trembling hands. Jason, the boy who had almost betrayed him, now stood between him and the enemy. And outside, in the darkness of the estate grounds, they were coming. Richard Grayson's people. The final battle had begun. The war comes to his doorstep. Henry didn't hesitate. Jason, get Lily out of here. Jason hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded. He grabbed Lily's hand and sprinted out of the office. Henry reached down and grabbed James's gun. He didn't have time to feel guilt. Not now. Gunfire erupted outside. Grayson had sent an army. The estate was surrounded, at least a dozen men in black tactical gear. Henry sprinted to the control panel in his office and slammed a button on the wall. Security lockdown initiated. All exits sealed. Windows reinforced. This wasn't just a home. It was a fortress. And Henry Evans was done running. The face of a monster. Henry didn't have to wait long. The security cameras showed a familiar figure stepping through the main gate. Richard Grayson. A tall, imposing man, dressed in an expensive black coat, his silver hair slicked back, his face showing no emotion. He walked with absolute confidence. Like he had already won. Henry watched him approach the front entrance. A moment later, the phone rang. Henry picked it up without hesitation. Grayson's voice was smooth. Amused. "Hello, Henry. It's been a long time." Henry clenched his jaw. "Not long enough." A chuckle. "You always did have a mouth on you." Henry's fists curled. "Cut the theatrics, Grayson. Why are you here?" A pause. Then, a single chilling sentence. "I've come for my children." The memory that broke him. The words sent a visceral shock through Henry's body. My children. A flood of lost memories surged forward. The dark basement of Willowbrook House. The children lined up, silent, waiting to be chosen. Grayson standing over them, whispering, "You are mine." Henry gasped, gripping the edge of the desk. He had heard those words before. He had lived them. And now, Grayson wanted to take them back. Over his dead body. The final stand. Henry activated the intercom, his voice calm. "I'm giving you one chance to leave, Grayson." Grayson laughed. "I admire your confidence. But let's not pretend you have the upper hand here. You're outnumbered. I have a fortress. I have men on the inside." Henry's blood ran cold. "You think James was the only one?" Grayson continued. "I still own some of them, Henry. I still own your children." Henry's mind raced. There were still spies inside. Even now, Grayson's people could be waiting for the right moment to strike. He had to end this. Now. The house burns. Henry made a choice. If Grayson wanted the house, then he would bury it. He pressed a second button on his desk. Security override, initiate lockdown purge. Deep beneath the estate, the fail-safe system activated. Seconds later. Explosions rocked the perimeter. Grayson's men were thrown back as the outer buildings collapsed. Fire erupted along the outer walls, cutting off any retreat. Inside, the fortress was collapsing. But Henry wasn't leaving without a fight. The final confrontation. Grayson's men stormed the estate. Henry met them head-on. Jason had returned, leading the fight. They fought through the hallways, room by room. And then, Henry saw him. Grayson. Standing in the burning ruins of the grand entrance hall, watching him. Waiting. Henry raised his gun. Grayson smirked. "Still fighting, Henry," he mused. "That's what I always liked about you. You never knew when you'd already lost." Henry's hands shook. "This ends tonight." Grayson tilted his head. "Are you sure?" A child stepped forward. A boy. No older than 10. He was holding a knife. His eyes were blank. Empty. Brainwashed. Grayson smiled. "I told you. Some of them still belong to me." Henry's heart shattered. But he didn't hesitate. He stepped forward. Slowly. Carefully. He knelt down. And he opened his arms. "Come here, kid," he said softly. The boy's grip on the knife trembled. Grayson watched. Waiting. Then, the boy dropped the knife. Henry caught him before he collapsed, sobbing. Grayson's face twisted in rage. "You think this changes anything?" he hissed. Henry stood, his voice firm. "I think it changes everything." Then he raised his gun. And fired. The monster falls. The bullet hit its mark. Grayson staggered. Blood bloomed across his chest. He sank to his knees, his lips curling into a bitter smile. "You think you've won?" he rasped. Henry stared down at him. "I know I have." Grayson laughed, a broken, twisted sound. Then, his body slumped. Richard Grayson, the man who had stolen children, who had stolen Henry's past, was dead. The war is over. The battle raged for another hour. One by one, Grayson's remaining men fell. By dawn, it was over. The estate was in ruins. But Henry's children were safe. Jason found him in the rubble, Lily clinging to his side. Jason's voice was hoarse. "It's done." Henry exhaled. Slowly. Deeply. He looked at the children, his family. They had survived. And for the first time in his entire life, Henry Evans felt free. The new beginning. Months later, the rebuilding began. Not just of the estates. Of the children's lives. Therapy. Education. A future. Henry ensured it all. The scars remained. But so did something stronger. Hope. One evening, Lily climbed onto his lap. She looked up at him, her big eyes filled with something he never expected. "Love. You're not going to leave, right?" she whispered. Henry swallowed hard, wrapping his arms around her. "Never," he promised. Because he wasn't just a billionaire anymore. He was a father. And no one, no monster, no past, no ghost, would ever take his family away again.